Here we go. Hello all, and welcome to the Lawn Chair Philosophy Foundation's first ever Scholar Spotlight presentation. Jonah Ragir, we are so honored and excited to have you as our first guest. I hear you have some Husserl for us. What are you presenting on today?
Well, thank you. I do, in fact, have some Husserl. I have some Husserl particularly focused on his notion of sedimentation and kind of getting to a more robust understanding of that. It's usually fairly neglected in Husserl scholarship. And using that to talk a little bit about habit and ultimately art and how art gets interfaces with what we habituate and how we can make use of art as philosophers.
Hell yes, we are all about that at the LCP Foundation with our aesthetic axioms and all. I'm going to go ahead and hand over the host reins, for I hear that you have a slideshow.
I do, in fact.
Yeah. Here we go. Make host. Yes, I do. All right. You're good to go. Lay it on us.
Okay. So we will be talking about the man, the myth, the legend himself, Edmund Husserl. And this is a bit of art, a favorite of mine. It was my desktop background on my computer for a little while. But just to get into it, the goal of this talk is to get into a really robust understanding of Husserl's notion of sedimentation, but some clarificatory notes that kind of clear up really common misunderstandings, but also how I view and read Husserl. Husserl is not metaphysically neutral, and he is not a solipsist. Husserl does have views that there is a real world. He just doesn't think there's a really real world. He is not a metaphysical realist by any means. And, you know, it was in vogue in the 70s and 80s to interpret him as such, but I think contemporary scholarship has really drifted away from that view. He's also not a solipsist. He's not committed in any way to saying all that exists is me. I think that's actually a really gross and uncharitable misunderstanding of him, especially with his emphasis on inner subjectivity, which we'll get to in the talk. But a little bit how I read Husserl and why that might result in me saying some things that are different from what people familiar with him would expect is Husserl died with over 2/3 of his work completely unpublished. These are untranslated shorthand notes. And he, especially in The Crisis, which is his last published work, distanced himself from his early thinking. He called it static phenomenology, what he was originally doing. And this original work is not bad. It just doesn't represent what his mature thinking were on all his subjects. And I think a lot of what's levied as criticism at Husserl is often people having read his Cartesian meditations or his logical investigations, which are relatively undeveloped as compared to his mature thought. So I won't really be engaging with that earlier Husserl as much as I'll solely be engaging with crisis and post-crisis Husserl, which, you know, if anyone's ever interested in that, there's some great scholarship by Dan Zahavi about why we maybe ought to do that. So let's hop into the actual shtick. There's kind of 5 key terms we're going to be working with in order to get clear on sedimentation, and they are the subject, the object, intentionality, inner subjectivity, and constitution. So the subject is totally identified for Husserl with the first person perspective. It's inherently something which is self-aware. That a subject does anything at all presupposes a kind of self-awareness that's distinct from any kind of reflective attitude or activity. The subject is that which intends objects in the world, and we'll get into what intentionality is in a bit. The object, on the other hand, is understood primarily as something that's kind of in reference to the object. from the get-go, the object is understood to be given for the subject, which, to put that another way, is that what it is to be an object is for it to appear for a subject in their experience. And there's something about objecthood which itself is either, if something is an object, that means it is apprehended or is apprehendable by me. And it's strange in Husserl's system to speak of a thing that exists, but which can be made in no way apprehendable. That would be rather odd. So just as a kind of side note here, subjects are embodied in a world. When we're talking about subjects, we're not talking about Cartesian cogitos. We're not talking about any kind of strange kind of contemporary revival of dualism. We're talking about a fully embodied consciousness, where a consciousness is in some sense identified with being embodied. So just preempting that misunderstanding. So intentionality is the aboutness or directedness of consciousness. The idea here is when we see something, hear something, remember something, imagine something, think, hate, fear, that seeing, that hearing, that remembering, that imagining, so on and so forth, all of those things are directed at an object of our experience. Put another way, intentionality is the aspect of consciousness that points out beyond itself to the world that it belongs to. So Husserl argues that intentionality is inherent and a necessary part of subjectivity, but he does not say that subjectivity consists in intentionality. Husserl, like Heidegger later, thinks that there are non-intentional states. Heidegger's example of that is like being merely happy, that happiness doesn't necessarily entail an object, and we shouldn't kind of misunderstand consciousness to be exhausted by its intentional moments. Secondly, that the fact that intentionality presupposes in some way that there are objects for a subject does not mean that it presupposes that there are objects simplicator, that there are objects out there waiting for us to intend. Husserl really differentiates between the fact that we sense things in the world and interpret those sensations from the fact that there are just objects in the world waiting to be sensed. So, intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity is kind of one of the trickiest points in Husserl scholarship, but the notion here is that it's the characterization of my experience of other subjects, and at the same time, the relationship that exists between subjects. It's not something which can be gotten at through kind of abstracting from first personal experience, but it's something that has been presupposed by my experience, by any kind of experience I'm having. The way we first kind of way we think about this ought to be something like embodiment. The fact that I am an embodied subject and I'm intimately familiar with that experience kind of qualifies me to recognize other embodied subjects and qualifies me to understand how our subjectivity relates. So there is some sense in which I can't confirm that my experience is really veridical without intersubjectivity. That is to say that we, in our experience, is kind of just a way we live in the world, go, do you see that pink moose over there? And that moment where you confirm or reject my experience is one of the ways in which intersubjectivity really makes itself known as like a part of our lived experience that isn't coincidental. It seems actually rather necessary. And as a final note on intersubjectivity, and this will start to kind of nod its head towards sedimentation, it has a role in shaping what my intentional moments are prior to the experienced moment. So Husserl, in his kind of mature thinking, talks about us being born into a kind of living and breathing tradition of intentionality. I can't help but take on patterns of intentionality displayed by those around me as kind of structuring how the world shows up for me going forward. For instance, each language speaker doesn't invent a language, but their intentionality is affected by it. The whole history and tradition of linguistic communication gets assumed by me and affects my intentionality without me knowing it. This is kind of one of the biggest gaps between Husserl's early thought and his mature thought is intersubjectivity should be seen to be incorporating historicity, generativity, tradition, normality, all of which I'll kind of call intentional norms, just as a working term. They're not mere norms in a traditional sense, but involve histories and practices and facts that we come to make our own and are going to be very significant. So finally, there's constitution. Constitution is the process by which an object becomes experientially graspable by the subject. Put another way, it's the work that necessarily had to be done in order for a subject to experience something like an experience of an object. There is, in my reading of Husserl, a kind of tripartite process to constitution. That is to say that there is work that I have to do or ways that I have to be in order for an object to show up for me. There are things that the object has to do, as strange as that sounds, and ways that it has to be in order for it to show up for me. And there's an intersubjective moment in there as well. So I'm going to pause real quick before we go into the rest of this tripartite constitution and see if anyone has any questions on what we've gone through so far. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, so I'm just going to assume you're following, but I'm going to give it a beat.
Oh yeah, I just not a question, but a hell yeah. I'm loving it so far. You know, and I'm glad that you mentioned that Husserl sort of redeems his earlier work and his later work. I personally am one to find, you know, a linear string, not without its bubbles and disconnections and errors that need to be, you know, not necessarily redacted, but explained further. I appreciate that we're starting here and that we're going to expound upon things that came before, because I think his earlier work is very enlightening, but you know, to judge him just on that and not look into how he, you know, conditions that is very uncharitable. So thank you.
Yeah, if I'll just like to bounce off that, Husserl is very judgmental of his early work. He calls it static, and that he himself misunderstood what experiences were like when he was doing that work. So there's an extent to which, like, if we are to take him seriously at all, we ought to take him seriously when he says he misunderstood something when he was younger. So to get back to this, so tripartite constitution. So as mentioned before, there's this intentional moment by the subject, which Husserl thinks of as partly interpretative. And he's not a sense datum theorist. He doesn't think that we're just like passively receiving sense data, but he does think that there are sensations that we have. Hot, cold, pain, colors, just raw sensations that we do interpret as objects. And that some of what interpretation is, or some of what, intention is interpretation of what we sense. That is to say that intentionality as interpretation is constituted by making it the case that there is an object of our experience as opposed to just raw sensations. There's further this idea that I have to be in a kind of a priori way receptible to objects. If I wasn't the kind of subject that was able to receive objects or interpret them, I I wouldn't have experiences. So that's kind of the other part of subjective constitution. As for kind of intersubjectivity, even though other subjects are constituted by me, which of course they're objects of my experience, I don't invent them. Rather, the other is constituted by this interpretative process, and it's understood to be distinct from discussions of whether subjects exist in their own right or not, other subjects. The intersubjective plays a kind of validating and confirming role in my constitutive moment, but there's also that idea of, from kind of the intersubjective, so to speak, I receive intentional norms that structure my further constitution. Finally, there's the object. It seems a kind of trivial note, but it is worth mentioning that objects have to be doing some kind of work or be a certain way in order for them to show up for me in my experience. They have to be the kinds of things which are apprehendable. And that seems a little trivial, but it is getting to this idea of all three of these parts play co-equal roles in this, which is the structure of an experience. So there is S, which is the subject, O, which is the object that is apprehendable by us, I, which is the intersubjective, and O sub P, which is the object of our experience, or the phenomenal object. And the idea here is that subject intends the apprehendable object. Intentional norms are handed down by the intersubjective to the subject. All three participate in the appearance of the object of my experience. And then, of course, it's the subject that experiences the object of experience. So sedimentation actually steps in on the right-hand side of this triangle. It's the precondition for past experiences or, inherited communal norms to alter a present intentional moment. So traditions and norms of judgment, either my traditions or intersubjective traditions, that produce a kind of prejudiced way of intending a moment. That is to say that what is sedimented is commingled with my intentionality so thoroughly and surreptitiously that I forget the original meaning of what has been sedimented, and it just posits itself in my experiential life. So to illustrate, I have a sedimented way of intending this coffee cup. Whenever I do, intend it, I'm acting from a lifetime experience and social norms, informing me how I can relate to an object like this. There's no moment where I am conscious of either my intentional or constitutive moments in relation to either the sensations of the coffee cup or the object as it appears to me. Neither do I have ready to hand any kind of consciousness of all the ways my experience and intentional norms from others are structuring how this coffee cup shows up for me. Now, this definition of sedimentation, that it's this kind of hidden way, is workable, but it's not the whole story. There's a reading of sedimentation that limits it to only what I've outlined so far, and there are people who misunderstand it to only be about things like science and mathematics. However, I think this conception really limits sedimentation, and it cannot be right because, as I've said already, it ignores Husserl's mature thinking. So Husserl's genetic term is this self-described transition where we depart especially from logical investigation and we start thinking of phenomenology as something which has a history and an origin, and that still is able to grasp kind of the essential structures of experience, but leaves room for how that experience has been conditioned by some kind of history. So the idea here is that rather than what's been sedimented being some kind of passive background, it's better understood as a living network of earlier experiences that are all continuously structuring what I experience in this moment. It's somehow part of our protentive attitude as well, which is something we don't talk about as much, which is this aspect of our lived experience that when we open a door, we expect it to swing open and allow us to walk through, and we would be surprised if there was a wall behind it. And that ability to have a protentive attitude and reasonably predict that I can lift up this coffee cup is only made sense of if we have this kind of robust idea of sedimentation. So further still, this kind of isolated, static idea of sedimentation totally misunderstands how a kind of fully formed person is built up in Husserl's thinking. So that is to say, there's this kind of, Husserl differentiates between what he calls the primal ego and the full monad. I'm not fully convinced why he uses that term, but it is the term he uses. And that in some way, we all kind of grant that the four of us who are on this call, or anyone who will listen to this talk, are all more developed, more fully human beings than we were as newborns. And that aside from the physiological changes there's some sense in which we're built up as beings that are capable to experience the world more fully. And that there's a procedural story here that we arrive as kind of fully formed experiential subjects only insofar as we are shaped into that by the experiences which we have. So, you know, it's not, I'm kind of dodging the particulars here because I don't want to get too bogged down, but the idea is something to the effect of everything from the culture I was raised in, to the language I speak, to the particular ways my parents raised me, to the fact that, you know, my dad only drank black coffee, and that's all I associate with coffee. All of these things in some way form a foundation that in a very living, very active way shape every experience I'm having right now, whether or not I'm conscious of that. So as to kind of wrap up this part of the talk, there's this quote from Husserl in The Origin of Geometry. The whole cultural world in all its forms exists through tradition. These forms have arisen as such, not merely causally. We also know already that tradition is precisely tradition, having arisen within our human space through human activity, that is spiritually, even though we generally know nothing or as good as nothing of the particular provenance and of the spiritual source that brought it about. So I interpret this as this idea of that there is an intentional attitude in these traditions that has a constitutive force of something like an anonymous community, that it manifests itself in things like linguistic normality. I've never not been among others a day in my life, and it's absurd to assume that conventions have not in some way shaped what is normal for me in how I come to experience the world. So this is all gels with this idea that we anticipate normality in our day-to-day lived experience, and that anticipation is only possible if we have some kind of sedimented base at which we expect the world to be a certain way and have prejudiced ways of interpreting and intending the world in its showing up for us. So, you know, I'm going to pause here, actually, before I take the beeline away from Husserl for the moment to talk about art and habit, see if there's anything.
Well, I would like to talk a little bit more about the interplay between the experiencing subject, the object, and intersubjectivity, and any sort of representation that's happening throughout. because there's a sense that they're working together. There's also this sense of opposition that I'd like to make clear. So I'm looking at his writings from Internal Time Consciousness, section 17. In addition to the contrast between direct perception or the giving of the present itself in a primary memory, which has its correlate in the given past, there is another opposition between perception and the recollection or secondary memory. In recollection, a now appears to us, but it appears in an entirely different sense than the sense in which the now appears in perception. This now is not perceived, that is given itself, but represented. It represents a now that is not given. And so too, the running off of a melody in recollection represents a just past, but does not give it. Even in mere fantasy, every individual is extended in time in some way, having its now, its before, and its after, but the now, before, and after are merely imagined, as is the whole object. Here, therefore, an entirely different concept of perception is in question. Perception is the case, in the case, is the act that places something before our eyes as the thing itself, the act that originally constitutes the object. Its opposite, the representation, understood as the act that does not place an object itself before our eyes, but just represents it, such that the fantasied now represents a now, but does not give a now itself. The fantasy before and after only represents a before and after, and so on. And so I guess I wonder at that tension, that discourse between all of those parts. On one level of sedimentation, there's a harmony. This is the process by which we come to apprehend. But I'd like to hear more about the contention between.
Yeah. Well, I think that a beginning to an answer to this question, not that I feel fully qualified to give it, is something like the way we might differentiate what's habitual for us versus what we remember.
Mm-hmm.
So that is to say, it seems like what Husserl is pointing out there, and he points it out in other places as well, is that there is no properly speaking object of our experience when we're remembering something. And that I feel tempted to say as a first answer that the tension versus harmony you're pointing out to is memory versus sedimentation. That is, that there's some sense in which sedimentation is not itself an experiential moment, as opposed to memory, which is an experiential moment, but one with no object.
Like there's the perceptive process versus the very directed, embodied, first-person experience of what's going on.
Yeah, when I smell my coffee and I remember that one time I was in a diner with my dad. Like that's a very different thing than everything which is built up for me to know how to perfectly use a coffee cup.
I don't want to ruin the surprise, but I'm excited about where this art direction is coming from. I personally am very much interested in how art can bring to the fore that perceptive background, the many tensions and layered dimensions of time which are constituting this sedimentation without contradicting the place of perception in its usual operations. So is that where you're going? Should I just hush my mouth and let you continue?
That's fairly close to where I'm going, actually.
Okay. Any more questions? I'm so excited. Sorry. Continue.
Are there any other final Husserl questions before I move on to art and particularly Alva Noé?
I want to get a sense. Oh, sorry, Nathan.
You can go first if you want.
Okay. I want to get a sense of how radical of a claim Husserl is making. Like, if he's just saying something like our perception of objects are constantly embroiled in terms of like how we use them. Like I understand that a cup is something that I drink from, which comes from tradition, and I wouldn't necessarily have that otherwise. Um, that seems quite that seems pretty safe. It also seems like there are like certain feminist ideas that show up where like um, our understanding of the politics around us are informed by like our place within society. But is he saying something further that like I can't even claim that I see a black book before me because that's embroiled in tradition as well, or even those claims swallowed up by
So, yeah, I think I get the question. I'll start with what I take him to not be claiming. What I take him to not be claiming is that the object wouldn't appear for us unless there was some precondition. Like, no, 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 no. Like, there would be an object of our experience because we're subjects. But something like it being a notebook or it being black, the color, and those kind of conceptions, and me recognizing it as such, and me intuitively knowing that I can pick up a notebook and do certain things with it, those come from either cultural norms or my own kind of extended experience with those kinds of things over time. And it's not that it's meant to be a revolutionary claim so much as it's making sense of how it's possible for us to have the kind of experiences we have without deferring to some kind of point of view that takes a lot of things for granted. Does that answer your question, Clay?
yes.
Okay.
I guess I'll go next. One thing you might get to this later in the talk, but I'm wondering what the exact relationship between, let's say, phenomenological normativity should be. When Husserl does talk about normativity and like the crisis, he often talks about, theoria or disinterested rationality as a kind of teleological ideal. I mean, and I'm wondering like what the relationship of what the exact relationship is between of how much sedimentation we ought to have as subjects. So I'm thinking like I think you're like Merleau-Ponty, who wants to argue from that our sedimentation of the world, our sort of inherited habits, actually obscure our ability to sort of experience the objects as they present themselves to us. In the case of the crisis lecture, it was the origins of mathematics and geometry as these kind of fossilized cultural forms that we've inherited as a cultural community of intersubjective interpreters, which can both illuminate and also obscure our understandings of the real world. So I'm wondering, how does Husserl want us to understand sedimentation? Is it something that we need to embrace in order to understand the world, like kind of like Gadamer and his understanding of like horizons of understanding? Or is it something that we need to kind of subtract, like the way, Merleau-Ponty or even some like, Zen Buddhists talk about beginner's mind, of like rinsing one's mind of, habits of thought?
So it's a good question. I have a few different responses. The first is Husserl would say something like, because the venture we're engaged in is transcendental phenomenology in particular, that sedimentation is only something that we discover if we're already engaged in a kind of radical epoche. That is to say that sedimentation is only something we discover about ourselves if we're already looking to bracket what we take for granted to understand our experiences as they actually are. So I don't know that he's gonna really have a value claim about sedimentation as much as to say, well, this is something that's just characteristic of subjects. I will say, though, that the crisis, so to speak, of European sciences is a crisis of sedimentation. insofar as these ideal abstractions of like physics have become sedimented such that they replace what we really experience. And so those are the kinds of things that I think he's saying we can't take that for granted. We have to understand that sedimentation is happening. We also have to understand that there's been what he calls the surreptitious substitution. And that is a bit of a value judgment. I'd also say that I'm going to get more into this once I'm talking about art, and art putting on display what has been hidden from us about ourselves. So I feel pretty confident about moving on now, y'all. Cool.
Yeah, you're killing it. Yeah.
So thinking about art. So Noe is not himself a phenomenologist, but he is a very phenomenologically friendly thinker. He brings on board a lot of these thoughts and these ways of looking at the world. And there are 6 basic, he starts his discussion with art with what he calls organized activities. And an organized activity is an activity that exhibits 6 essential features. First, that they arise from basic facts about us. These kind of facts could be we're mammals, or we live in cities. Like, no, cities is too unessential. I mean, even more essential. That we're bipeds. Second, that they are highly skillful and they display a wide range of mechanisms on the part of the participant. The third is that an organized activity is always temporally structured. That is to say, it's done through time. Fourth, that the demands of an organized activity give structure and organization to what it is that we're doing. So to put that another way, the activity itself dictates what the performance ought to be. Fifth, organized activities are purposeful. They have a function for us. And finally, they are at least potentially a source of satisfaction. These aspects are something that will be identifiable in any given organized activity, regardless of its instantiation. Noé uses actually the example of breastfeeding as an archetypical organized activity. And that the very activity of breastfeeding arises from basic facts about us, that it's a skillful activity, that it's temporally structured, that the activity itself organizes how we enact it, that it has a function for us, and at least potentially can be a source of satisfaction to the participants. So what about, let's start to shift from organized activities to art. So art is the activity that we take up to put these organized activities on display. So the hallmark of these activities is that once the hard work of having learned them is done, they're habituated for us. And by habituated, I don't mean that they're unintelligent in any kind of way, rather that they are unreflective and they become hidden for us. So there's an example like this that, sorry, I've lost it. Oh, here we go. I found myself. So these activities are displaying a wide range of cognitive and embodied skills, and those skills are required of us in order to actually achieve the enactment. And the habituation of these skills resembles something more like the way that, you know, at first we are fairly bad walkers. But by the time that we are good walkers, we don't have to think about walking anymore, despite the fact that we haven't given up any of the cognitive or embodied demands that it takes in order to walk. It's also worth mentioning here that tools and technology are a part of this process because they emerge from our kind of biological lived experience. So art is the activity we take up to put what has been habituated on display. Noe has a really good example that I like, which is that art is like a model or display apartment unit. What it's doing, or the value of it, is putting the apartments of that particular kind of complex on display for a potential buyer, while obviously not being the apartment the prospective renter would move into if they chose to take up residence in that building. Art has a distinct function from what it puts on display, just as the model apartment has a distinct value from the apartment the tenant would eventually move into. The apartment's value is in the living in, making one's own, etc. The model apartment's value, despite being a model apartment, is rather to put apartments and all of the values that we associate with apartments on display for us. But art is deeper than that as well. It puts what is hidden on display. The fact that we're all movers, shakers, rhythm enthusiasts, these are the kinds of things that are hidden from us outside of the moment of our enactment. But choreographed dancing puts that very hidden fact about us on display for us. So Noe calls this aspect of art reorganization. In taking in art, that is, in taking in what is hidden about us and putting it on display, we're reoriented in our attitudes and our ability to perceive or conceive of what we put on display. To put it another way, the value of art is to take this or that organized activity, walking or breastfeeding, what has been made habitual and hidden, and put it on a display so that it can be discovered and investigated. That's not to say that this account of art says that this is the artist's intentions, rather that this is the value of the art they produce. We make art out of organized activities, and in so doing, we're laying bare what was hidden and where habit places us. So it's critical here that we think of art as a second order activity. In some sense, it's a rising out of that first order organized activity and putting the first order activity on display. This is a kind of, in at least Noe's thought, and it's something I'm really receptive to, this is a necessary response to the disorientation we find ourselves in by being organized to the extent that we are without our explicit knowledge. So from this, entanglement steps onto the scene. Entanglement takes the form of a looping problem. Level one is the level of the organized activity or the technology. Level two is the level where the nature of that organization at level one gets put on display and investigated. And so these reorganizational practices, that is to say art, loop back and change our first order experiences. So let's look at the example of dancing. It seems beyond doubt that we now dance such that we mimic the choreographed dancing that was first meant to put our dancing on display. If suspicious, just go to a club when you are next able in the future, when clubs reopen, or take in a TikTok dance challenge, since that's probably a little more manageable. And just note the unoriginality in the way people move. And that's not meant as a criticism. I'm a very bad dancer. It's meant to note the idea here that how we dance as first personal agents, that habituated way of doing things, has now in fact been shaped by the choreographed dancing that was meant to put our dancing on display. To put it another way in more theoretical terms, the second order activity, which was meant only to put on display a first order activity, becomes integrated into the first order activity. In so doing, the second order activity, art, reorganizes the first order in our enactment of it. This produces another iteration of that first order habituated activity, now altered by the incorporation of that reorganizational art, which in turn is ready to be put on display once again by a new instance of art. This continues over time until it's unintelligible to speak about those two levels, art and the original organized activity, as being truly distinct in a meaningful way. So the issue here is, so to speak, is that these two levels are so entangled over this continuous process of looping that it renders unintelligible any effort to analyze one or the other in isolation. So it's not to say that we can't identify first and second. You know, you can look at My Attempt to Dance versus Rihanna's music video and that choreographed dancing and confidently identify the difference between organized activity and art. But it's rather that when we're identifying one or another, we are doing nothing to explore or dissolve the interconnectedness of the two. And just kind of as a final note here, Noe actually draws a very powerful comparison where he starts to think of philosophy and art as species of the same genus. Philosophical problems, at their heart, seek to put on display what's been hidden from us in the exact same manner as art. While there's kind of a prima facie distinction in the form between philosophy and art, it's actually not as big as we might think or as relevant. One might think of the difference between writing and dance as being no more distinct than the difference between literature and philosophy in a meaningful sense. More importantly, the value of the activities are the same insofar as they seek to reorient us towards what they're putting on display. And once again, as we've already talked about, artists aren't necessarily carrying on the intent to put things on display, nor might philosophers be. So before we go to this last part of the talk where I start to put these two together, sedimentation and entanglement, I want to leave room for another little moment of talking.
I wonder about the role that his epoche can play in allowing us to differentiate between my experiencing subject and the structures of another's as they're in their dance. He's writing in image, fantasy, image, consciousness, and memory, section 17. He writes, we have to distinguish intuitive image consciousness, the consciousness that belongs to immanent imaging, from the images that function as symbols, and from the image consciousness that comes about in the symbolic function of the image. Only the consciousness belonging to immanent imaging plays a role in the aesthetic contemplation of the image. In aesthetic contemplation, we immerse ourselves in the image, our interest belonging to it. We see the subject in it. The image obviously does not have the mere function of awakening a presentation of the object that would be external to the image, of awakening the new intention of the object, or just a conceptual presentation of it. Naturally, I do not wish to imply by this that the interest and meaning belonging to the aesthetic image is directed exclusively towards the subject, as if it were always only a matter of bringing the subject to intuitive presentation. When the image operates aesthetically, it may indeed be the case that a new presentation brings the subject or some of its components to a more complete intuition, say to more fitting coloration. And so I think that's what you're getting at in these empathetic, intersubjective structures coming to the fore and us being immersed in it. But then he mentions later on exceptional occasions, one can also enjoy one's fantasies aesthetically and contemplate them in an aesthetic manner. Then we do not merely look at the subject in image consciousness, rather what interests us is how the subject presents itself there, what manner of appearing in image it displays, and perhaps how aesthetically pleasing the manner of appearing is. Thus, the artist will listen to and lie and wait for his own fantasies in order to see them the most aesthetically beautiful poses, or he directly experiments in fantasy, so on and so forth. When we fantasy, we live in the fantasized events. The how of the internal image presentation falls outside the scope of our natural interests. So if we are under the influence of the epoche, maybe it is the case that we can keep distinct those elements. We can make distinct the how of our perception and the moment of the dance, if you will. So I don't know, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I will say, I mean, first of all, it's interesting. I think of the epoche as something we engage in rather than fall under the influence of, though I'd be interested to see if those two are really so meaningfully different. But yeah, I mean, I would say although this is not where I'm heading in this talk necessarily, that where I'm heading in terms of characterizing this entanglement problem in terms of sedimentation means just kind of trivially that however we can get a handle on what's been sedimented, i.e. engage in a transcendental epoche, we could also utilize to get a handle on what's been entangled.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's what I meant by under the influence. You know, we've put ourselves under that influence so that we can, you know, make distinct the original impression, any conception, you know, which has its lineage from that, and distinguish from any sort of fantasy and memory, and like you said, make clear which dimension we're operating on. Okay, so yes, that does answer my question.
Cool. Anybody? Oh, go ahead, Clay.
I'm not convinced that that art and philosophy are really species of the same genus, and that it's not just we've defined what sort of artistic pursuits are so broadly that essentially everything falls under it. Like, it seems as though certainly psychology would have a very similar stance to art. Then it's hard for me to even see, like, not just all of science being a second order activity that's examining ordered activities. So like, wouldn't just all human pursuits of knowledge be of the same genus in this sense?
So, yeah, so I think that's a good question, if only because it forces me to clarify further. I don't think of psychology as, you know, as someone who is in therapy, I don't think of psychology as putting on display what's been habituated for me in the way that walking is habitual or dancing is habitual. That's not why I go to therapy, nor is it the value of therapy to me. And I also don't think of, you know, experimental sciences or hard sciences. I don't think of chemistry as its value or its interest in either way being about revealing in a meaningful way that I've forgotten that I used to have to think about how to walk and what that process was. I don't think of chemistry as meaningfully putting on display the fact that humans have rhythm and that we're all kind of rhythmic. So, you know, I don't think it's contestable that most, you know, academic pursuits put things on display. I mean, that's kind of what they're for, is we're going to put on display a model of the universe, is what astrophysics says. But that's a very distinct claim from we're putting on display what human beings have habituated and forgotten about. Does that draw a distinction for you, Clay?
No, I don't think so, because I think it could still easily get swallowed up, especially if you have certain views as to exactly what science is trying to explain. Like, if science is just trying to explain sort of perceptions that we are habituated to, like certain ways we think of the universe, then like it would still, it feels like it would still end up swallowed up by the same definition.
May I jump in?
Sure. I saw you unmute yourself. I was waiting.
Husserl is going to say that all techniques, all crafts, whether it be of a more, as we would say, artistic sort, and the sciences fall under an art of measuring, for all action is directed intentionally at this world and reveals something about this world. The thing about the hard sciences is is that their manifold, their field of study, their horizon of measure is determined by certain ideal object shapes, as Jonah had alluded to before, those ideal objects. And those, delineate their field of measure. And so while all arts are going to reveal something about the world, each science, each technique, as a mode of being, will reveal something different, will reveal a different dimension of the world. And each scientist or artist will present something unique to that field, given their own immediate experiences of the life and within their own life world. So in the one sense, there is this grand unifying horizon, this one world in which we are all measuring. We all partake of the same structures of consciousness, but art, as we know with the fine arts, particularly relates to fantasy image in a certain way, whereas the hard sciences deal with a different type of fantasy. They're more dealing directly with the understanding, I guess. So there's a difference between image consciousness, which the fine arts are dealing with, and then there's more of the traditional straight up understanding that's built upon time consciousness and memory, which are going to determine objective measure more so for the hard sciences in a rational, in a literally ratio, metaphorical kind of way. Does that help?
Yeah, I should state I should try and state my objection more clearly then, I think, which is like I'm not concerned that we can't delineate art and science. That we couldn't that at some level they won't be delineated, but once we get down to discussing what faculties we're talking about, we can delineate them. I'm concerned that what's being described here, like the similarity between art and philosophy, is still at a level where we won't be able to delineate between philosophy and science, or art and science. Well, delineating between philosophy and science seems hopeless anyway, but
so just to, I'm going to give another attempt at this answer, and then I am going to move on, because I don't know that how worth it is to get caught up in this before moving on with the rest of the talk, and then maybe we return to it at the end, which is the hard sciences, particularly I'm thinking of things like chemistry or astrophysics. They don't have to do with organized activities in the way that art does. So that is to say that even biology, which has to do with, biology would have a lot to say about walking and breastfeeding, but biology doesn't really have anything to say about, per se, how we are kind of subjectively, so to speak, conditioned by it, organized by it. The fact that we forget that we are organized and conditioned by it, and seeks to put what we've forgotten on display for us in a way that biology will state the mere facts of how walking is possible. It will not put on display the whole phenomena of being organized by walking and forgetting that we were organized.
And Clay, I guess I have a question. Are you concerned about Husserl turning all of philosophy into a science so that we can't delineate?
I think I'm mostly concerned that if we don't saying that these two activities are similar in this certain aspect, that if it's too broad, then it's just sort of a specious claim more than anything. But I'll set it aside for now.
Thank you.
Nathan,
Well,
you were going to say something.
I can save it towards the end. Maybe a way to resolve this impasse.
So, just towards talking a little bit more about how these two ideas are coming together, Noe and Husserl, entanglement and sedimentation. It might be the best place to start is this idea of Husserl talking about the body as an intentional apparatus. So the body, or more accurately, our embodiment, is not only a means by which we intend the world, but it also structures our intentionality. By the very nature of the body, it structures the possibilities of how a body is used. So that is, by some definition, something which could only be present for me in my current experience if it's something which was taken on board, structured by sedimentation of experience of norms in regards to my embodiment. The idea of the intentional body directly evokes the way Noe conceives of embodied actions being structured and organized activities that have kind of faded into a habit without our notice. So there's a tentative thesis here that organized activities are the kinds of things which are sedimented in Husserl's account and which express what is sedimented. So recall that habit for Noe often takes on a non-deliberative but still skillful character that is the result of a given organized activity. After all, we would not be particularly good walkers if moving our legs in a certain way weren't habituated for us over time. But this kind of habituation that's central to the idea of getting organized seems to presuppose a kind of process that Husserl describes when talking about how our past experiences become sedimented. So there's a temporal structure of the activities in question that's also deeply held in common. Husserl conceives of any experience as having the structure of retention, the past, protension, the future, and impression, the present. To intend an object is for Husserl to be actively aware of what was, what is, and what I can reasonably expect there to be. That's to say that all experience is structured along the lines of what we can expect to follow. These kinds of expectations could only be the result of either experiences or intentional norms. In either instance, sedimentation is a kind of precondition for those expectations. Habituated action presupposes experience having that kind of a structure. I wouldn't be a very good walker if I didn't have the kind of protentive expectations surrounding the activity such that I could walk without thinking. That is to say that walking or breastfeeding or any organized activity relies on the temporal structure of past experience and expectation. This temporal structure in turn directly presupposes the way in which sedimentation structures our experience. These points seem to indicate that in some sense, sedimentation is the process by which we get organized. Put another way, habituation of an organized activity, that is, it's becoming hidden from us and in need of being put on display, is a result of sedimentation. So let's take this a step further. Noe conceives of these second-order activities, art, as taking on board more than just the first-order activity, simpliciter. Art and the second order bring on board a whole living tradition of what has already been habituated in terms of a way of doing things. So ballet, as choreography, putting on display not just the fact that we're dancers, but ballet puts on display a rich cultural tapestry that stretches back all the way to medieval courtly ideals. It seems that in a robust account of how Noe was conceiving of art, we can state that it's not merely putting on a static aspect of this or that organized activity, but the whole sedimented field of habit which goes into it in this kind of spiritual tradition that Husserl was talking about. That is the whole living, breathing set of norms that Husserl insisted gets sedimented as a kind of precondition of our unreflective experience. So let's elaborate this, and let's bring art more fully back into the picture. Grasping sedimentation reveals that our understanding of what it actually means to be an object a picture, a value, or something real or merely imagined, is often covered over and distorted by traditional prejudices. This is directly evocative of the task of art, putting on display what is hidden behind habituation and organization. Husserl insists that transcendental phenomenology is not something which we can become situated in. We do not become at home in it. It does not sediment or become habituated itself in the way that mathematics might. This is the same lesson which could be drawn out of the strange tools that art produces. We could not become at home with a tool taken out of its context where it's ready at hand. But art does loop down, at least our moment of perceiving the art, of experiencing the art, does loop down and sediment in a way that Husserl would claim good philosophy should not or could not. So this brings us back to entanglement and appears to introduce one of two disjunctions. The first possibility is that the looping down of art, its capacity to affect what has been habituated and reorganize me, is sedimentation in action. And we have to draw a distinction between art and philosophy that Noé might object to. Alternatively, the second possibility is that there's no problem to be solved here, and that I was wrong in drawing such an interpretative line as to identify sedimentation with entanglement and organization in such a way. So let's try to clarify. What solves this problem, I think, is a closer investigation of the difference between making art and experiencing art. There are, after all, quite different activities, whether the art in question is a painting or a paper written by a philosopher. Making and experiencing involve entirely different skill sets, entail a totally different intentional attitude. The making of a piece of artwork doesn't require the same kind of bracketing on the part of the artist, an epoché, but this goes hand in hand with saying that the function of art is distinct from the purpose and psychology of the artist. But the object of art that is created, at least as it is experienced by me, has a whole horizon of meaning that is distinct from the purpose the artist set out for it to have. It's in that experiencing of the artwork, not the making of it, that I can enter into something which resembles an epoché or a bracketed experience. That is to say that it's not inherently in the choreographing of the dance where a kind of reorientation takes place, but rather in the taking in of the dancing by the viewer. But this seems to merely reintroduce another problem. It points to another troublesome disjunction between phenomenology and the artist. If the artist isn't recognizing themselves in the making of their art, and we wish to maintain that, you know, in some sense, philosophers and artists are producing different species of the same genus, we should try to make sense of Husserl's move in claiming that phenomenologists are doing their own reorganization in the making of their art, in the making of their philosophy. So that is to say, does the phenomenologist, A, incorporate the epoché or reorientation in the making of their art, or B, is phenomenology an artist's making, so to speak, which presents experienceable content that initiates or calls for an epoché on the part of a reader? I would say that once again, this is a false problem. There's no disjunction at the original level of making. The phenomenologist is trying to put something on display, say a crisis in science, and in so doing, provides content which has reorganizational potential. This very action presupposes a kind of bracketing of what was taken for granted, such that it could be seen differently and get at what was hidden and, say, for instance, how we accept science. So to say that the artist, in some sense, does not do the very same thing is absurd in my view. Whether intentional or not, an artist is looking at their subject matter from a different perspective or a different awareness. Art is, after all, not a mindless activity. While the epoché or the bracketing on the part of the phenomenologist might be more purposeful and explicit, artists are no less bracketing what we tend to take for granted in our lived experience. There is a disjunction, though, at the level of the artist experiencing their craft, per se. The phenomenologist ought to have an attitude such that they see the reorganizational content of their craft as calling for yet a more radical epoche or a more radical bracketing, while the artist tends not to see such a need. I don't want to make a universal claim here. This is not necessarily a deep problem, though. Art, as in philosophy, shows a wide range of explicitness of its reorganizational content and its own capacity to influence its own artist. There's, after all, a wide range of explicitness between Hegel and Daniel Dennett as there is between Tolstoy and David Foster Wallace. We might even say that the philosopher who is not a phenomenologist, that is one who is not committed to an abstraction away from all that is taken for granted to find what is hidden, might more resemble a traditional artist in their capacity to make art without being reflectively aware of what it is that they are doing. So setting this problem aside, I want to kind of make a final note based on the discussion above. Organized activities seem to presuppose the very structure of sedimentation, and organized activities like art, or reorganizational activities like art, I should say, seem to be putting what is sedimented on display. For an activity to organize us and then become hidden assumes a structure of experience which is explained directly by the phenomena of sedimentation. So it seems that second-order activities' purpose to put what is hidden as a result of these organized activities, it only makes sense to think of art as putting what is sedimented on display and calling for a kind of epoche or bracketing. So entanglement seems just like a natural consequence of this interpretation, is explained by it. Subjective experience is prone to take on board all these kind of changes that entanglement the problem of entanglement is pointing out in the first place. And art and second order activities generally are things which I experience and can become new intentional norms for me and are the perfect candidates to be sedimented. So to emphasize this connection and kind of dot this I, it seems as though Noé's concepts get at the very heart of how sedimentation occurs. While it's certainly not the full story, the habituation of an organized activity is an illustration of sedimentation that I think sheds light on the way we take on board experiences such that they structure further intentional moments. So all of this to say that even if there is not a perfect identity between these concepts, as there well might not be per Clay's questions, they still hold tremendous explanatory power in making sense of one another. And just as some final notes, I have a couple of claims. The first claim is that phenomenologists, or rather philosophers interested in questions of subjectivity, need to take another look at art as a way of getting at what has been sedimented and habituated. If art makes tools strange that have never been strange to me before, or a habit unfamiliar, which I have never noticed or I took for granted, then art opens up a path for the phenomenologist to walk. The second claim is more tentative since it's making recommendations to artists. Artists either are or in some sense committed to doing what Husserl called the transcendental epoche. This follows if you take Husserl's comments seriously that philosophers require an epoche-like move in order to get to the real work of philosophy, and B, agree with Noé that somehow art and philosophy are up to the same activity. But even if you only accept one or the other, or neither of these propositions, I argue that one can come to accept Noé's characterization of what it is that art does, that is, put what is sedimented or habituated on display, and that it necessarily follows from that that requires some kind of a stepping back or a bracketing by the artist, that while is not necessary for them to do, could be enhanced by what it is that Husserl's methodology calls for. And I think that's all I want to say, other than to throw this up of suggestions for further reading for anyone who might see this recording. Aside from Husserl's own book, The Crisis, there's several books on here by scholars Dermot Moran and Dan Zahavi, as well as 2 works by Alvin Noé, where the majority of my discussion on his theory of art comes from. And that's all I got.
Yay! That was fantastic. Thank you, thank you. As long as we're throwing out readings, I have to make a shout out to Saul Ganusis, who's out in the Phenomenological Research Center in Hong Kong, I believe. I'm probably saying that name right, but he's just wrong. But he has just written an immense book on Horizon, which I think would speak very much to that. Or to all of this, you know, and I wonder at some of Husserl's earlier work and being able to detangle this difference between what's happening with art proper and philosophy proper. I might disagree with Husserl in his analysis of his old work. I think there is something to be said for a science of essences to help determine the slight distinction between what artists are doing to reveal this radical subjectivity and what philosophers are doing to explore it.
I mean, I'm a Hegel fanboy. So first and foremost, before Husserl. So this whole question of essences and appearances is, of course, something I'm interested in. But I think that there's tremendous potential there, given especially that both Hegel and Husserl saw themselves both as completing Kant's project. And Kant's project was first and foremost about this kind of transcendental puzzle of essences.
Yeah.
So there's something there. And also, I don't think he completely dismissed his early work. I don't know. I've never read a letter where he's like, everything I wrote before the crisis was BS.
I think he further clarifies upon it, especially in reaction against such negative reception with what Heidegger did to him, and Sartre was writing. But I think to speak to that distinction, I think, you know, you're right in that artists really are bringing to the fore the hidden structures of apperception, and begging us to question what determines our horizon of meaning. I think, however, we can make fine distinctions about the difference between philosophers and any other group of artists or scientists in the particular way which they describe essences and for what purpose and towards what end. And that definitely has to do with the history of the tradition itself, which we can't escape fully.
Yeah, I think, which kind of goes back to Clay's question, even if you don't necessarily buy that art and philosophy are species of the same genus, I think it still is true that art is, in some sense, up to the activity of putting what is hidden in our lives, this apperceptive, sedimented part of ourselves, on display in such a way that at least phenomenological philosophy and art share a really kind of eerily close purpose and identity and value that benefit from one another.
Definitely.
Anyone else want to say anything in the last minute?
These were just some of my scattered thoughts, but I think there is something to be said about the parallel between philosophy and art. I don't know if they're the same genius. So let me go this way. I think your conclusion is correct, that the activity of art and philosophy are very closely related. They definitely share a clear common ancestor, you know, in this hierarchy of intellectual activities and transcendental structures of the ego or sediment, or however you want to conceptualize that. I think, however, at least the theory that No puts out, I actually think is not a particularly convincing theory of art. I mean, it seems to work very well with mimetic art, you know, art that is meant to mimic reality, you know, so that could be, the painting of Rembrandt that you showed. Dance, I think, would be a good example of that, you know, being able to aestheticize what was once conventional, habitual movement, into something that is novel. But I don't think that really covers things like non-representational art or art that's meant to or the idea of the spiritual in art. So it seems that it is so it does seem that philosophy and art do serve as these second level activities that causes kind of this feedback loop that reorients ourselves towards something. But I'm not entirely convinced that it's making us remember our bodily habits, as maybe No seems to think it does. I mean, that at least that's not a very convincing explanation of the entirety of human artistic expression. Maybe some, but
yeah. So I have a kind of two-part response, which first of all, as a man with 2 Kandinsky tattoos, I'm very receptive to that point. Being raised playing jazz, that there's a lot of very, very abstract jazz that is no longer representational strictly of human melodic habits. But, I would say 2 things. One is art can be mimetic of itself. I think you don't get to abstract art in a vacuum, so to speak. But I would also, and as much as I'm not really committed to that, but that is a first pass. The second is, I don't think Noé should be read as saying entanglement always happens. And I would even, he might not agree with this, but I would even go on to say that not all art is a second order activity. That these are features of art. But I don't know. I vacillate on that a little bit, because it does seem like both I and Noé are committed to saying something like being a second order activity is something which is kind of an essential aspect of art making. So yeah, I don't know that that's particularly resolved, but
I think the way I would phrase it is that there is a homology in the transcendental structures of entanglement in the act of philosophy and in the act of art. I'm just not convinced by the purely bodily and activist vision that No is setting out.
got it.
What does he say about symbols, to take it back to that earlier? Because I think, he said all objects are going to be, maybe, I don't want to say product, but a product of blending into, their past moments and further adumbrations of their perdurance. However, there's a certain, symbolic nature to certain types of art, which will occasion second order thinking. And it's upon these symbols and possibly signs that we can start to have the second order analysis, and maybe the job of the phenomenologist in an aesthetic experience is to determine, is this raw art, or is there some sort of secondary symbolic nature to it that we can begin an analysis upon?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that, at least nothing's coming to mind for me about Noé's idea of semiotics. That's not popping into my head really actively. But I do think, just to be kind of positive in my own thinking, that there's something, and it also kind of reaches back to Nathan's question, or Nathan, since he's there, that it would really seem strange to me, especially as someone who's, the child of artists and is an artist, to talk about art as something that in no way reflects my world embodiment, that no matter how abstract the art is, that it's not in some sense situated in my whole kind of horizon of existence. That there's something there that's not, even if the symbolism or the representation or the putting on display is super duper super abstract, not explicit at all, it seems weird to me that I could somehow make art that is not somehow representational of some part of my lived experience.
You know, one time I was terribly depressed, and was just making stuff up on the keyboard, and I played it to my friend afterwards, and she goes, "Oh, that's so happy and so uplifting." I'm like, "Really?" I listened to that, and I just am taken back to the depths of despair. So I wonder, like you said about that distinction between the artist and the one who receives it, because I listened to the YouTube video that I made, and like I do see directly myself in that and the terrible time I was having, and it is clearly on display. But for somebody else, that part of myself was completely missing. So I wonder if what you said earlier about that distinction between the creator and the receiver of the art has something to do with that.
I don't know. Nathan, it seemed like you wanted to jump in.
No, I was just going to say, well, one idea that just sort of came to me on top of my head is, I know in a lot of like in South American indigenous textiles, they have very brightly polychromatic tiles. And I think many ethnobotanists think a lot of these patterns come from visions that come from ingesting psychedelic plants. So that's part of, so they're entering an altered state of consciousness where they're seeing things that are, barely non-representational, but it's still within their like lived horizon, even if it's not, an everyday occurrence. So that might be a way out. Like,
well, and it's not just the psychedelic experience that's being put on display there, but the cultural practice of taking psychedelic plants in that way, and that whole, it's the same thing with ballet, where ballet calls back to medieval courtly culture and is putting all of that history since on display and doing what it does. So these, textiles you're talking about are not just putting the psychedelic experience on display, but the lived kind of, as Husserl calls it, the spiritual culture, which is, as a Hegel fanboy, I also love that term, is putting all of that spirit on display as well.
Right. And I guess a Hegelian way to resolve it is that the universal will always be in the concrete. I guess one way of, I'm also thinking that there's a lot of, I'm thinking of especially like modernist art, or even like where the symbol is not just the representation, it evokes a kind of reality that's beyond the mundane. Or maybe that's more just like 19th century symbolism. But
we are starting to get into the particulars of art in such a way that my answers are perhaps going to be unhelpful. Just to be frank. You can talk about opera, but that'll be opera and jazz. That's about my outer limit.
Well, maybe another example would be the debate in like the debate about like programmatic music versus absolute music. The idea that like opera was sort of a debasing of like the pure abstraction of like of music. How would you situate something like pure abstract music, be it, the Ninth Symphony or John Coltrane?
Yeah, I guess the first pass I'd give at an answer to that is, like, when we're talking about the evolution of music, we're talking about the historicity and generativity of human culture.
Right.
And so, like, there's one extent to which I want to be a romantic and say that music is putting on display the human spirit, just like the soul. But I also am tempted to say something like that music is the intentional product and putting on display this kind of whole cultural history that you don't get Coltrane in a, you know, in a vacuum of a positive moment of an artist coming up with something, having never interacted with people and never played anyone else's music and never heard anyone else's music. And that there's a self-referentiality to art that is, you know, to put it in your terms, highly mimetic when we're getting to kind of a theoretical observation of it. But this is, again, getting to a part of aesthetics that I'm not so steady in.
Kind of like Douglas Hofstadter's idea of like strange loops.
Not familiar with that.
It's a little, never mind.
Sorry. Well.
Yeah, any other questions or comments? Well, if some come up, we have the newly established Discord course discussion boards. Please do email me if you'd like access to that. There is a section for each of the authors in our Google Drive, and so we could open up the Husserl discussion if any more questions come up there, which I very much encourage. Jonah, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. That was so invigorating. I am just alive now, and I don't know how I'm going to sleep tonight. So thank you, and damn you for that.
It's how I live. Sleepless nights meditating on the mysteries of Husserl.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. That definitely made for a lively discussion. This hopefully will be up by tomorrow. It's going to take me a little bit longer to upload this video than the others because my computer died and I have to wait till I get to school to use theirs. But we'll get this up soon. Stay tuned for in 2 weeks. We have David Valentine's Scholar Spotlight presentation, which is about the reception of Kant in Husserl and Heidegger, I believe. So I look forward to that. Stay tuned for our PBR series and all the other fun events that we have coming up. All right. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
All right.
Stop recording. Oh, can't. I don't. How do I? Oh. Oh, here we go.